Okay, and now for the English, this is it's a little bit of cheating because I already told the story, so I know the story. But I only told it once, so I guess I have to, reconstruct it again in my mind. And so the keywords that I've gotten from Yona, thank you very much for your first contribution. The keywords that I got were frying pan, armadillo, it's an awesome word, armadillo, and pajamas and a pump. And the story, as I had just transmitted, went as such. Once upon a time, there was an armadillo. And for the English version, he can't be called the same, so he's going to be called Jonathan. So there was an armadillo called Jonathan, and he lived in a land far, far away where there was lots of sand. The whole country was covered in sand. And as he was growing up, ever since he was a kid, he wanted to be a blacksmith. He wanted to do things with iron, to forge things with iron, and so that's what he learned to be. That's what his profession became. And he was a really excellent blacksmith, forging metal in fire all day. And because the country where he lived, it was full of sand, that means that, if you ever tried biking in sand or roller skating in sand, it's not really working well. So what he did was he decided he wants to dedicate his life to creating like metal plates to make it, to cover the sand so people could ride like bikes and prams, which is short for perambulator, which is one of my favorite English words. So bikes, prams, velocipedes, all wheeled things could ride safely through this sandy land, and that's what he did. And then his neighbor, whom we shall call Joshua for the time being, his neighbor was an anteater, and so Joshua was building carriages, wooden carriages, and the wheels for wooden carriages, so then they would often also cooperate because the metal plates had a lot of friction on the wood, so Jonathan would build like these metal rims for the wooden wheels that Joshua built for his carriages. And so that's how Jonathan the Armadillo lived. He had this workshop, his blacksmith workshop. He was a very successful blacksmith. He did all these metal plates to cover the roads so people could drive and enjoy and feel and experience freedom. And that's how he built this routine life, waking up, eating breakfast, and he always ate breakfast in a special pan. He had a special pan, so he'd make breakfast, eat breakfast, go to work, blacksmith, forge, and go back, and his life was a nice routine. And then one thing, totally randomly, one morning, something happened that changed his life, and so he took his pan, his favorite pan, and put on his breakfast, so apples and worms and whatever little animals that he was eating, and he was trying to take the pan to the stove, and the handle just broke off, and the pan and everything just fell to the floor, leaving a mess. And for some reason not quite known to himself, this was so devastating, it really shook him up, and he started crying. Like sometimes it happens to us, that something seemingly unimportant just happens and it really shakes you up, and it's like the final straw. It's really just something else basically going on underneath, but then something happens and it shakes you up. So he was standing in the middle of the kitchen looking at the spilled apples and worms and all the little animals that he was about to have for breakfast, and he started sobbing uncontrollably. He just couldn't stop, and it felt such a disaster that his breakfast got spilled and there was no one there to help pick him up. There was no one to soothe him, and he was just unable to pick it up, to clean up, to carry on with his day. He just stood in the kitchen crying, looking around, feeling devastated, feeling utterly alone. and just felt this deep, deep, deep need to be soothed, to be caressed, to be just taken care of. He was alone, and so he was looking around the kitchen helplessly, and then his gaze wandered through the kitchen door to the living room, and in the living room he saw his pajamas on the couch. And then he got this moment of crazy inspiration, which we all do sometimes. So he took the pajamas and he tied the end of the sleeves together. He tied the upper part with the lower part, and he tied all the openings so that there was no room for air to escape. And then he took a pump and he pumped this pajama like to a full-blown armadillo size. And there it was. There was this instant armadillo soothsayer that he could then lay next to, and so that's what he did. He just hugged this blown up pajama armadillo, and he just felt this comfort of being next to someone soft and warm and soothing. He was just crying and crying and crying, and you know, armadillos have these like shields. So he had this shield for his entire life, and nobody knew what was going on, what the landscape, the psycho-emotional landscape of this armadillo was underneath the shield. Nobody knew about his tears, about his longing, about his emptiness, about his void, about his fullness. Nobody knew, because he had never let anyone see underneath this shield. So this crying just opened up a valve inside his soul, and it let the tears out, and he was crying and crying and crying. And the more he cried, the more he changed color. So he wasn't like brownish gray anymore, but he was growing more and more colorful. So when the tears, this river of tears, this flow of tears of pent-up sadness and emptiness and the feeling of disconnection ran out, he was no longer a gray armadillo, he was a rainbow armadillo. And he was really like flexible. And before, when he was walking, you know, he tread with really heavy steps, and now when he was walking, it sounded like music. And he didn't even know of the change because there were no mirrors in his house. So he just cried his tears, felt better, had no idea that he had become a rainbow armadillo. He just picked up this food, cleaned up, went to work. But then something happened as he entered the smithy. He picked up the hammer and to start hammering against the anvil to create more metal plates. And he couldn't. It was just not right. He could not do it anymore. So he just let the flow of his inspiration guide him. And he started smithing, and what came from under his arms were instruments. So he made a triangle. He made strings for a ukulele. He made strings for a guitar, for a harp. He made really, really, really nice sounding wires for a berimbau. He made all these instruments. He just couldn't stop. So from that day on, as he became the rainbow armadillo, he could no longer smith metal plates for roads, but that was not a big deal because they had been stocked in huge piles. So whenever one would had to be repaired or had to be replaced, they had people to come there and take and replace. And from the day on, Jonathan the Armadillo was creator of the most magical musical instruments. And I'm so glad that I just recounted this tale of how this happened, because I'm pretty sure that when I'm done broadcasting, I'll give you his contacts in the comments, and if you want, I'm sure he'll be glad to sell you or make you some of his instruments. So that's the story of Jonathan the Armadillo. The Slovene version is in the previous video, and I'm looking forward. I need you, any one of you, to give me a few keywords for tomorrow's story, because we're going improv from now on. Thank you for your attention, everyone, and I'll see you tomorrow at 6 p.m.